Hello, my name is Matteo Smerlak, and I'm delighted to present to you some aspects of the work we do in my group entitled The Structure of Evolution. But before we start, I thought I would tell you something about myself very briefly, just so you see that somehow I have drifted in science. I started working in quantum gravity. I was trained as a physicist, as a theoretical physicist. And after 2013, when I attended the Complex Systems Summer School at the Santa Fe Institute, I grew more and more interested in topics that were only tangentially related or completely unrelated to quantum gravity. And in 2017, I decided to give a go to a research group focused on evolutionary dynamics. So what I'm showing here for you is my path in space-time. And as you can see, obviously, there is some curvature in this connection. It's been an interesting journey, and I'm still very much at the beginning of it. With this, let me tell you a little bit about the composition of our group. We are an interdisciplinary group. At the moment, we have 5 postdocs working, as well as 2 students and 1 research assistant. The postdocs here have backgrounds in physics, bioinformatics, biology, physics, and ecology. Our students come from computer science and bioinformatics. So this is what I mean when I say we are an interdisciplinary group. The purpose of this orientation is that we have goals that I would define as follows. We want to deepen the integration between evolutionary theory and mathematics and physics on the one hand, and also on the other hand, engage with fundamental questions related to evolution using simple models. And already it's clear that this cannot really be done if we stay within the realm of physics, don't engage with biologists, or focus strictly on the mathematics. We have to bring these aspects together if we can attain this goal of sort of integrating deeper evolution and math. The resources that we have for this project are foremost a Sofia Kovalevskaya Award, which amounts to €1,600,000 spread over 5 years, and I started the group in 2018 with these funds. And later on, I got, together with 3 other teams, a grant from the Human Frontiers Science Foundation. This Early Investigator Award is more specifically dedicated to the origin of life question. I will not be talking much about this, but this is work that we also do, particularly with the bioinformaticians in the group. So what's evolution? Since Darwin, we understand by evolutionary dynamics the dynamical process in populations that is generated by replication, which is the fact that parents give rise to offspring, and that is a process that is seen across life from bacteria to whales. Heredity, the fact that some information is passed on from the parents to the offspring, meaning that the offspring in some ways resemble their parents, but also with the addition of variation, which means that the offspring, although they do resemble their parents, are never exactly the same. And the combination of these 3 factors of replication, heredity, and variation brings about change in populations, and this is what is meant by evolutionary dynamics. Of course, since Darwin first drew this sketch in his book in 1859, there have been major achievements, some of which pertain to the reconstruction of the tree of life. This is the historical aspect of the science. We now know much about how life evolved in its shapes and forms from the beginning of the history of the Earth to today. We also understand much better now the molecular basis of evolution, how genes code for proteins, and how the interactions between genes and proteins bring about change at the molecular level, which by itself influences forms at the macroscopic level. So the interactions between molecular change and changes of forms at the macroscopic level are much better understood today. There also have been efforts to understand better the evolution of cooperation, prosociality, topics which pertain to the evolution of behavior, and many other achievements, of course. But I just wanted to give you a flavor of what has been achieved in a century and a half of evolutionary theory. Some questions, however, remain fundamental and open. I've singled out 2 of them here. One is obvious in the context of a pandemic, say. Can evolution be predicted and controlled? Can we tell where a species a molecule, a genome, will go some sort of steps in the future from now? And can we control that process to some extent? So that is definitely one set of questions that are fundamental. Another is, how did evolution start in the first place? What is the origin of life? And what is the sort of minimal molecular toolkit that you need for this process of replication, heredity, and variation to get started? Those are fundamental questions. This is background for where evolution stands today. And based on this, we are now trying to connect some of these questions with different areas of mathematics. And some of them I've highlighted on this slide. Certain areas are more closely related to statistics, and I'll tell you something just now about this. Others have more to do with nonlinear dynamics, optimization. I've sort of made this slide here to show how central evolution is to many different problems in mathematics, and in fact needs to connect to these different areas of mathematical science. So let us begin by sort of looking into aspects that are directly related to the process of selection. Selection is the fact that when a phenotype, when a trait occurs in a population being coded by particular genes, and this trait brings about a larger number of offspring on average, then that trait tends to spread. This is the process of natural selection. And fundamental to this idea is the concept of evolutionary fitness. It is defined in the field as the expected number of offspring that can be produced given a particular genetic makeup. From this, selection can be conceptualized mathematically as a transformation of random variables, positive random variables, defined in this way. If W refers to the number of offspring, and you create a new population for the next generation, sampling through the old population proportionately to W, then you're effectively constructing a new random variable, a new distribution of fitness that is biased in this way. What that means is if on the x-axis here you have fitness, the higher the fitness, the more likely you are to be selected. And so this is what the arrows represent here. Now, my very first work in this field with Yusuf amounted to show that under certain tail conditions on this fitness distribution, after T generations of this process of selection, a universal family of distributions is generated. In fact, the Tth iterate of selection produce asymptotically a log gamma distribution under suitable tail conditions. Now, this should remind you of extreme value statistics, where by the Fisher-Tippett-Dynenko theorem, we know that the maximum of n copies of a random variable becomes asymptotically within a generalized extreme value distribution. This has the same flavor, and indeed you can think of selection as a form of extreme statistics. It consists in sampling from a population those individuals that have the largest fitness. Now, it was fun to see that in various problems that are not directly related to evolutionary theory, this distribution appears to sort of play a role, this asymptotic distribution. For instance, sires are obviously selected to have high performance. And if you look at empirical distributions of the performance of sires, you find a good fit with these asymptotically log gamma distributions. Similarly, for NBA players, which you might argue are selected for their height, the higher the player, the more likely to be selected from college team to NBA and so on. And it is perhaps not surprising that distributions of this kind are generated in this way. This is just for fun. I'm not trying to say something particularly deep, but really to show you that there is some sort of general statistical pattern of selection which evokes extreme value statistics and probably goes far beyond natural selection. So this was the flavor of one type of work that I did in this field before I started the group to get it to get it going. Another set of questions, which I've already kind of mentioned briefly, is the question of predicting evolution. Again, a sort of deep question in evolution, which in some cases can be addressed. And this is one other area of work that I will present to you now. Previously, we talked about the notion of fitness, the fact that a genotype can be assigned a number corresponding to the expected number of offspring that a carrier for that genotype might have. So a picture that was introduced by Sewell Wright in the 30s is that of a fitness landscape. So this is what is shown here on this diagram here that he drew by hand. The idea is if you have a map from sequence space, the space of all possible genotypes, to the positive numbers, then fitness defines something like elevation. The graph of the fitness function defines a surface whose elevation characterizes the fitness, the relative fitness of different genotypes. And from this sort of picture, he said, the problem of evolution as I see it is that of the mechanism by which the species may continually find its way from lower to higher peaks. Now, this was a metaphor, of course, because back in the 30s, there was no way to measure empirically the evolutionary fitness of a species, but this has changed over time, as you can see, since the 1990s. The number of papers published that contain the phrase empirical fitness landscape grows linearly, and now in 2020 we have over 10,000 publications that contain this, this phrase. And there are now examples of very detailed maps of the fitness landscape for particularly molecules that are relevant. Here is a sort of picture of a landscape of a small ribozyme. Now, if it becomes possible to measure fitness landscapes, can we answer Wright's question? Can we find the way in which a population will evolve in that landscape to find the higher peak? And in fact, is it true that it will always go to the higher peak? So given a fitness landscape, how can we predict the direction that a population will take in that landscape as a function of that landscape structure, its topography, as well as parameters such as mutation rates, which are displacements, elementary displacements in the landscape? So a natural way to picture this is in terms of a multi-type branching process, which is what I'm representing here. I, J, K here represent different types, different possible genomes, if you like. Branching are replication events. And so if you want to describe the population at a given time t, what you need to know is who's present in that population at that time, as well as how many offspring each of them have. And because it's a multi-type process, because there are mutations, the type of the offspring might be different than the type of the parent. So this is all characterized by functions, by random variables that represent the random number of offspring, starting from a parent of type J into a type I. Now, under very high genetic diversity in large populations and high mutation rates, such as, for instance, in RNA viruses, or in other processes such as the affinity maturation, which is part of our immune system, you can have, like I said, very diverse populations for which the stochasticity of these events is to some extent washed out. And so this process can be reduced into a dynamical process for the expected values. So constructing the mean matrix that has the fitness values in it, as well as the mutation rates, the mean of each one of these psi variables, then the composition of the population from time to time is represented by this dynamical system here. Now, by itself, it's not particularly easy to read off the direction that a population will take based on this mean matrix. And I've proposed to consider instead not the whole sequence of change that occurs in a population, but really the fate of those lineages that are successful in evolution. So I've highlighted one here in green where you see that some lineages might end and fail to reproduce at some point. Other lineages will end up being members of the asymptotic population. So if you, instead of considering the whole branching process, focus on those lineages that are successful and track the changes of types along these trees, here you can see I, J, K along the green lineage, then you're defining a Markov process in type space. This is in contrast with the branching process, which is a Markov process in compositions of populations. And so this is really useful because type space is really where the fitness landscape is defined. To construct this Markov process, what you need is the mean matrix, M, as well as its dominant right eigenvector, R. And so this formula here defines a Markov process in type space that corresponds to asymptotically successful lineages. So studying this process, I propose, is a good way to gain insight into the prediction problem in evolution. To give you a flavor of this, here I've pictured a Gaussian process that represents a rugged fitness landscape in 2 dimensions. And starting from the retrospective process that I just defined, which can be viewed as the original mean matrix tilted by an effective potential U, given by this formula here, then what you see is, so if I'm plotting here downstairs, the effective potential, it's a lot smoother. It has well-defined local minima, and it becomes easy to predict the motion. So if I initialize a population somewhere in the landscape around here, I'm sorry, it's not particularly easy, and you let it evolve dynamically over time, you find that it goes from one local minimum of the effective potential to another very predictably. It would be very difficult to make similar predictions directly from the fitness landscape because of its ruggedness, and also because the highest peak in this landscape may not be the eventual attractor for the dynamics. This is related to the topic of the evolution of mutational robustness. So the results that you get out of this picture is now the metastable states in evolution can be identified as the local minima of this effective potential, the deep ones. And you have a natural coarse graining scheme for evolutionary dynamics, which is in terms of the basins of attraction of the local minima of the effective potential. This is a reduction in complexity for the problem of predicting evolution in a given fitness landscape, which pays off. One example is if you consider the landscape of sequences that are either perfectly neutral or completely lethal, so only 2 possible types, a binary fitness landscape, and you define a neutral network as the subset of genotype space for which sequences are fit, then you can check, as an observation that I made, that the retrospective process is nothing but the maximal entropy random walk on this network, which is defined as this stationary stochastic process, which has maximal entropy rate, meaning that from one point in the landscape to another, every path of a given length has the same probability. This has implications for the molecular clock, which is a topic that has been explored much by Kimura, and it brings about corrections to his formula for the rate of the molecular clock. So after statistical patterns and issues of predictions, I want to tell you something that we are working on as well, related to the foundations of evolutionary dynamics, namely growth. One of the elements of evolution is replication, and that is directly connected to the question of biological growth. Now, evolutionary theory rests on a central assumption, which is that of exponential growth. 1 bacterium becomes 2, becomes 4, and so on. It turns out, empirical evidence suggests that this is not true. This is not how biological processes operate. And you can see this from data at various levels, from ontogeny of individuals, which is the rate at which they grow their bodies, to the rates of reproduction, which is how fast they produce offspring, to the rate at which social insect colonies grows over time, to the production of entire communities in whole ecosystems. In each case, you find a scaling relationship between the growth rate and the mass of the body, in the first case of a colony or of the entire community here. It scales, but it scales sublinearly, which means that the rate of growth of mass is not proportional to mass itself. It's sub-exponential. You have an exponent here, k, which is near 3/4 equivalently at all these different levels. Ian Hatton, a postdoc in my group, has made major contributions to these empirical patterns, and we together study the consequences that this has for issues such as the stability of interactions in communities. We showed in this paper in 2015 that this fact of sublinear production leads to locally asymptotically stable equilibria for many different kinds of coupling functions, many kinds of consumption or loss functions. The stability of ecosystems has long been studied under exponential growth, which leads to difficulties. But this problem is resolved directly through this sublinear. And there are many different consequences and implications of sublinear growth that we are exploring with models as well as nonlinear dynamical systems. So to summarize and give you some outlook here, I've chosen 3 topics to present to you today. The first one has to do with universal statistical patterns of selection. I've showed that selection is somewhat equivalent to extreme value statistics, or directly related, in other words. This gives statistical signatures of selection. When you find these particular distributions that emerge asymptotically, then you have an element that suggests that selection is operating on this variable. But there are questions related to stochastic perturbations of these patterns in finite populations, which we are working on. I told you something about quasi-species dynamics, which is the dynamics of large, genetically diverse populations, which includes viruses, if you wish. I showed that the intermittency of evolution can be thought of as the metastability of the retrospective process, which is a very fertile direction that we are pursuing. And I've told you about growth patterns across scales, all the way to entire ecosystems, suggesting that there are mechanisms at play that have to do with the way growth organizes itself, which stabilize interaction, which have consequence for natural selection, but for which there is no known mechanism. But this is not the whole set of projects that we have ongoing or with results. Just to give you a flavor here, we have worked on diffusion approximations, and the paper is in review in the Journal of Theoretical Biology. We are working with collaborators in Spain, France, and the US on genetic fragility in viruses. Issues related to the origin of life is under investigation as well, and so on. I suggest, if you are interested, to have a look at our group page for more publications. And with this, I thank you for your attention and your time.